The super mutants are written at their second best here in Fallout 1. 2 expertly expands their characterization, fitting for what happens to them as a group in 1. While New Vegas does continue to develop their characterization as a group, the wider story is more interested in the human factions on a geopolitical and economic scale, and thus, the mutants play a smaller role compared to these older games. We don't talk about the rest. The best part about the mutants in Fallout 1 is just how little influence you have over them as a group, in stark contrast to the rest of the game, where you can change the socio-economic structure of multiple towns and uncover ancient secrets for a powerful faction whose own members died attempting the very same thing. Thus, you tangibly alter the wastes to how you see fit through events that reinforce this kind of player agency. And yet, the one faction that has the most galvanetic ideology and practices, the faction that has the most power to control in the region, tied only in force, not in numbers, by the best fortified group in the entire series. This faction cannot be altered in their current state, only destroyed. Well, I mean, you could join them. While this narratively implies that a peaceful resolution is not always possible, and thus thematically offset compared to the best of the later games, it still offers a salient opinion on contending with other groups when the stakes get this high. When a conflict-prone group you must confront absolves themselves of the rules of the social fabric as a means to achieve their ends, it often results in the erasure of peoples. None of the decisions you are forced to make need to resolve to anything close to genocide. They can, but the player is always aware that whatever the outcome, it is a direct result of their choices.
Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stone.
It seems the devs are trying to convey the gravity of the issue through the limited options you have compared to the rest of the groups. Total war isn't something the Fallout games take lightly. We see it over and over when a town like Nipton meets a mind like Wolpes. Even if a town survives, the local economy and society are destroyed. Without a larger, effective binding force, they compartmentalize like a lot of towns in Fallout 2, only to get absorbed into the largest power structures like in New Vegas. When it comes to Fallout 1's conditioning of the super mutants, taking on the first group you find in Necropolis the first time you arrive is a guaranteed death sentence for you and all of your companions. Coinciding this with the knowledge the player gains if they are captured instead of fighting, and exposed to the FEV ending, cements exactly who the super mutants are and just how little most of the wasteland could do to stop them. This, in addition to the random encounters north of the Brotherhood at first that are always a reset, reinforces both the devastating power and geographical reach they have. I mean, they made it all the way to Necropolis. The hub and Addendum are right there. Fighting with the mutants is so nasty they recontextualize the mechanics of combat, maybe the game itself. Unlike any organic encounter preceding them, nothing hits so hard from so far away. Nothing has so much health or armor while so many of them are in a group. No amount of medical supplies, armor, or guns will save you and your party from getting launched into the sun at least once per fight. They are so much worse than anything you fought so far, save for maybe a Deathclaw. They force you to alter how you approach combat, now with even more limitations and hazards and liabilities. Yet the gravity of this change poses a moment of reflection, to regard the hardships you've been through just to get here. Once you're fully at war with the Unity, fighting them really puts into perspective as to what's on the table, how helpless countless lives would be under their occupation, and just what the alternative outcomes really are. Suddenly, busting my ass to resolve conflicts between peoples doesn't seem as bad as This conditioning can run so deep that I actually clapped out loud as if cheering the first time I saw anybody kill a mutant in half on their first strike. That is how much committing to this design can influence players to their core. Fallout 1 does such a good job with a single encounter and maybe a couple random encounters that even when they give you the context to characterize the mutant faction, cheering was still my reaction to seeing one fall so easily. This is one of the best examples of narrative conditioning that I can give of this design, eliciting significant and valuable emotions from a player. While I would have liked there to have been a mechanical use for the player's knowledge within the game world when you get captured at Necropolis, as the character cannot retain the information after a reset, the encounter still serves as that galvanic factor for the conditioning around this faction. As for the ghouls, they're treated much like Neil and Marcus in New Vegas. As H-Bomb put it in his analysis,
I love Neil, and he's written to be an introduction to the more subtle and complex mutants of this game.
and I think this is true for most of the important conversations you have with ghouls around the waste. Aside from Set and some others, characters like Harold and the underground ghoul leader ease the player into the difficulties of life here as a ghoul. I mean, just check out this line. It's like they're saying, hey, if you do this, there will be consequences. The only mechanical function of ghouls as a group is similar to the other towns regarding perceived wrongs, although this mechanic does get a spotlight if you happen to take the water chip from Necropolis and don't fix their pump first. A group of ghouls waiting outside the computer room attack you, making this line scan a little bit better if you had fixed the pump first. Oops. That and the feral ghouls only become hostile after getting too close. A pretty neat little addition to help separate Necropolis from other towns. Feral ghouls can actually spawn in random encounters, which I thought was excellent when I first found one. Speaking of random encounter, Group 3, the Wastes. While the combat system works at its peak in tandem with the player and group mechanics like Necropolis and the Mutant Army, traversing the open wastes on the map screen becomes a genuine threat to your survival too. Deadly encounters and inhospitable terrain will spell doom for your party if you aren't prepared for the risks. Massively dangerous radiation, roaming packs of bear-sized scorpions, dog-sized mantises, desperate raiders, deathclaws, and yes, mutants. In the second game, they crank this up to 11, with encounters including factions at play in the story fighting each other in random locales, something that would be echoed throughout the series. If you don't invest in your outdoorsman/survival skill, late in the game you'll be risking a lethal encounter every time you step outside town limits. Many NPCs will reveal local threats to be aware of and describe what it's been like to deal with them, further tying the unfolding story in with the environment through the mechanics of player speech. The enemies ramp slowly from tutorial rats and a single mole rat to a pack of rad scorpions and raiders. By the time the game adds named NPCs and their groups to the mix, they have already offered companions to ensure your survival. This slow ramp isn't a bad thing, as the player mechanics in the beginning all but guarantee that even these will give you some trouble. Act 1 peaks when you track a lone deathclaw that has been picking off caravans for sustenance. Tracked, but unlikely to be killed at this time. After some errands and sleuthing, you make it to Necropolis in the second act. Slow, short-distance ghouls hoard to your location if provoked. Sewers filled with corpses and more rats. You might find an enclave of ghouls that seem well-armed compared to everything else so far, and they mention something about a watershed. I take the time to detail all this because I hope it will be obvious when you see him, a big, looming green mass. Not immediately hostile, but you can tell he means business and that he and his friends aren't supposed to be here. Then you meet his boss.
Lou tell me watch place. Take normals to the loo. Hey.
This one interaction deftly flips the player's expectations of everything you have come into contact with. Up until now, everything that has obtained its power out here has either held immense sway over combat or used their intelligence to build an alternative. The combatants you do end up fighting always have an obvious reason as to why they have survived in the wasteland up until this point, and they make this painfully clear to the player once they are in combat. This ensures that whatever you end up fighting has a unique interplay of the enemy and player mechanics, whether that is needing to take cover from long-range artillery, breaking limbs to slow dangerously fast enemies, blinding gunmen, surviving because of a critical failure, and more. These mutants here seem ill-equipped for an intelligence build, yet they arrived in a coordinated squad, and if you dare to test them, like I said, certain death. The game also does something devious here, since the game expects the player to have gained both the knowledge of the mutant's plan, as well as the conditioning against their cause. When the player reaches the watershed, they are given 30 days to resolve the super mutant conflict in Necropolis before the Unity exterminates the entire population. Both ghoul communities wiped out. This is brilliant, utilizing narrative aspects of the setting as a mechanical conflict for the player, not unlike the water chip. This army is for war. Once their scout group has found you, it's only a matter of time before you are destroyed. You must choose between getting the water chip home and saving Necropolis from the Unity. At this point in the game, with the player, environment, and combatant mechanics that I've detailed, it gets genuinely difficult to watch your character and your companions in combat. Right in the middle, before you can take on the mutants comfortably, but after the Junktown debacle, it creates a genuinely compelling experience, having your attempts at using combat to resolve problems get frustrated by opponents far outclassing anyone who doesn't have at least one party member. Not for petty issues such as a 50% chance to hit missing over and over, or because the only weapons you have don't match your skills, like in the first act, but because the things you face, and sometimes the place you face them in, are really that deadly. A single miss, especially a critical failure, means annihilation in a lot of these cases. And I mean, it makes sense. I keep saying it, but this is a ruthless environment. These guys have a literal building worth of guns, and they're afraid of sending guys to deal with this Mother Deathclaw. So it should be that trying to take it on alone would end this way most of the time. Outside of combat, the world of course feels reactive, with NPCs having new things to say as quests develop or end, as many RPGs do. Not just the NPCs directly related to the quest, though. Like the whole town of Shady Sands after defeating the Rad Scorpions, people may have something to say about how what you did affects them, which is a nice little touch. In addition to reacting to the player, the world's events have and will develop with or without you. We saw a significant version of this in Necropolis through the invasion countdown, but it shows in small ways too. There's a random encounter where you meet a wanderer who has had a similar level of impact on various settlements around the wasteland. I happened to meet him days south of where he helped out, so I guess he was on his next side quest. Violating local laws like pulling out a firearm will cause most, if not all, of the locals to become hostile and start combat, like I mentioned before. But because of the way combat works, you feel just how many people you have pissed off through the mechanics. While tedious if you genuinely wanted to fight, it is neat nonetheless. All of the thematically mechanical reactivity demands your attention. In the mundane, like information gained from speech, yes, but more importantly, if you don't pay attention to the setup of a conflict, it will resolve without you. It feels strange and unsafe navigating Necropolis around these mutants, and that's the point. For reasons we've gotten into, and because the developers need the player to remember this moment, this scouting party. If you don't know the gravity of the situation, if the developers don't get this across to the audience, the developers would be the ones letting Necropolis die, not the player. The environment itself holds the player to standard through its visual design, another way to condition the player to the setting. Little stuff like grainy, washed-out wastes, accentuated by bright colors, and brilliant emblems forewarning the factions to come. This extends from the streets to the map traversal screen, as the cohesive layout and effect of the terrain serves a larger role in immersing the player in an environment that demands consideration before traversal. These systems at this scale are complex, though, and when committing to this kind of design, there can be no singular mechanic that breaks the challenge of a fight or dilemma. When you have dozens of mechanics interplaying around a single settlement, it becomes exceptionally challenging. Having a tightly tuned combat system helps to avoid the opportunity the player has to make the experience fall apart or lose immersion, and the game certainly has this kind of system for more than the first act. While you have low-level equipment, healing supplies are expensive and somewhat sparse, you can't grind in the traditional sense, and you're missing a notable amount of your shots. Avoiding the loss of immersion later as your character gets stronger manifests through environmental factors like the availability or lack thereof in ammo, armor, and heals, the outright vicious combatants, the fragility of your companions, unavoidable environmental pressures, and attrition during longer levels. These systems are tightly tuned. The same, however, can't be said about other choices. Thank you for making it this far if you have, and subscribing if you did. Follow me next time to see what my analysis deems the largest mistakes, both in my own work and the game's.
Excellent.